Trigger is the newest electric stunner to be released, while seemingly being designed exclusively to be paired with ZenlessZoneZero Ambi. But I'll be honest guys, based on my testing, she is so much more than that. She is one of the craziest and most satisfying stun characters I've tested thus far, and with this, I also tested every single team composition that could possibly include her. So as usual, today I'll be showing you how to play her, what her pros and cons are, and the conclusions that I found while testing every single team she can be used in. The goal with today's video is to give you guys a better idea of whether Trigger is worth it on your account. Before we go further though, I would also like to remind you all that the footage from this video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. With this out of the way, let's break down every single Trigger team in ZenlessZoneZero. Trigger's core gameplay revolves around her unique resource, which allows her to remain off-field and apply damage, daze, and provide the team her stun damage buff. Her gameplay loop involves filling her resource bar to full after using a charged basic attack, performing a quick assist at the end of said move, and then activating Trigger's attacks with another character while she is off-field. Like Ambi, these off-field attacks are considered aftershock damage, so sets and buffs that affect this are ideal. That said, while the dazing and damage she deals while off-field is already plenty of value, her core passive increases a target's stun damage multiplier by 35% for 5 seconds, even when the enemy isn't stunned. This makes Trigger even more impactful for a team, and is also part of the reason why she's very competitive even against characters like Nicole, Chingy, or Lighter depending on the scenario. Now it's time we talk about her actual kit mechanics though. This next section is an explanation and summary of Trigger's mechanics, but the full breakdown will come once I release the guide later, so stay tuned. Trigger's core passive is very simple. When Trigger's aftershock hits a target, the enemy then has its stun damage multiplier increased by 35% for 5 seconds. Now what makes Trigger unique from other stunners is that this damage increase actually applies even when enemies aren't stunned, so this effectively means that she grants bonus damage regardless if the enemy is stunned or not. Next, her additional ability is activated when she's paired with an attack or an electric agent. Once activated, any crit rate exceeding 40% from Trigger will increase the daze inflicted through aftershocks at a rate of 1.5% for every additional 1% crit rate. This has a cap of 75% though. Additionally, this does mean that Trigger's build needs 90% crit rate to maximize this increase. Her generic basic attack combo should rarely ever be used, but her charged basic attack is the exact opposite. Her charge attack first puts Trigger into a sniper stance, but then proceeds to fire at enemies in front of her. Successfully hitting a target will generate 25 purge up to a maximum of 100. However, upon releasing the charged basic attack, Trigger will perform a finishing move that also activates a quick assist of the previous agent in the squad. While in the stance, Trigger also automatically dodges and can reposition herself freely. Now the reason Purge and Trigger's unique resource are very important is because they allow her to activate Harmonizing Shot or Harmonizing Shot Tartarus while off-field. To activate Harmonizing Shot, an ally must first perform a basic attack, dodge counter, special attack, dash attack, or quick assist after Trigger has accumulated Purge. But to activate the Tartarus version, an ally must use an EX special attack, an assist follow-up, or an ultimate to then use a more powerful form from Trigger. Now while activation and damage are two big differences between the Tartarus and non-Tartarus versions, it is worth mentioning that casting these shots costs Purge, and the amount of Purge consumed by each ability changes depending on which version that she casts. On the topic of harmonizing shots and Trigger's off-field capabilities though, let's talk about her EX special attack. Trigger's EX special attack deals a decent amount of daze and damage, but more importantly, this ability activates a quick assist and also has Trigger enter the coordinated support state. This is highly beneficial to Trigger and her allies, as this form allows her to use harmonizing shots without consuming Purge. To add to this, while the state only lasts 8 seconds and can trigger 4 times at base, repeated triggers extend the duration, increasing up to a maximum of 20 seconds and 10 total activations. Given that Trigger essentially leaves the field after gaining maximum Purge, you might now be curious about just how relevant the rest of her abilities are, so let's get into that now. To start, her dodge abilities are pretty standard and nothing special. On the other hand though, her assist is amazing for generating daze, making it highly worth using whenever possible for building up stun against an enemy. In addition to this, Trigger's assist follow-up allows her to activate Tartarus, while any quick assists will perform the regular harmonizing shot that Trigger has access to. To be clear, both are amazing value for a mostly off-field stunner, so prioritizing these attacks whenever possible is definitely going to be your goal. Regarding her chain attack, this is an ability with okay damage multipliers, but it really doesn't do much else. Finally, her ultimate is an amazing daze tool when activated, but it also has the benefit of sending Trigger into the coordinated support state. Like with her EX special attack, this is incredibly valuable for additional damage and daze against enemies, so it's definitely worth managing and optimizing whenever possible if your goal is to beat up enemies faster. Now as always, before before we get into the teams, I would like to explain the structure of my testing. First, the teams listed and described in this next section always had the main DPS's additional ability active unless they were being paired with Astra. This is because Astra is super OP, but that's not all. Second, double stun and double DPS teams were also experimented with as well. And third, to no surprise, Miyabi, Bernice, and Yanagi were still very strong regardless of what team they were used in. Now that said, there was another topic that I wanted to get into before I move on, and that's actually in regards to a topic that I addressed in my last video. In said video, I detailed how some teams were powerful, but constraints or limitations could stop you from wanting to use said team. This is a bit vague, so to be more clear, what I meant was that in certain cases, like with Deadly Assault, using a team like Miyabi, Bernice, and Yanagi all in one team can and definitely will yield decent results. However, in practice, this may actually prevent your account from clearing other stages more effectively. In a character like Bernice's case, for instance, being used alongside Miyabi in an Ether Ice Weak stage when other fights have fire weakness could certainly lower your overall Deadly Assault score and consequently reduce the rewards that you earn. In that sense, some of these teams may be good, may not actually be as realistic or as viable to be used depending on the content that you're using them for. Now let's talk about the standards and setup that I used. The following teams had M6 on A ranks, M0 on S ranks, and the signature W engines / reasonable options of these agents. This means a character like Lighter would have a signature and someone like Sokaku would have Bashful Demon, but additional changes were sometimes made if a W engine performed too poorly, like with A rank Ambi. Finally, as always, these findings do need context because things like the target, their stun meter, their buffs, and other factors can affect these results. The first team setup I experimented with was Trigger alongside a DPS and a support. This was the most comfortable set of teams that I tested, and their performance was definitely the most consistent too. At the top of this category were teams like Trigger, Miyabi, Astra, ZenlessZoneZero, Ambi, Caesar, and various combinations of Caesar plus Astra together, but you probably guessed that already because these DPS and these supports are easily the best in the game. That said, Astra and Trigger alongside any DPS performed amazingly and was pretty simple to play too. Long story short, have Astra or Caesar enter the field briefly, apply your buffs to the team, and debuff enemies if necessary, then swap to your selected DPS to one-shot everything in sight. Now, in regards to the best DPS, there was a clear trend of Miyabi, Evelyn, and ZenlessZoneZero Ambi being ahead of everyone, and this makes sense since they're the most recent DPS and their damage has definitely outpaced some of the 1.0 agents. But while this was definitely the case for most teams, other sometimes older teams still performed well, so let's get into that now. Among other DPS plus support teams that performed decently, 3 specific pairings stood out in the form of Trigger Juyuen Nicole, Trigger Yanagi Rina, and Trigger Harumasa Lucy. Now, despite their performances, it is worth mentioning that each of these teams had their own optimizations necessary, as characters like Rina, Yanagi, and Juyuen without a support do need some practice before using them to the best of their abilities. That said, these lineups were some of the most consistent, assuming that you didn't have access to characters like Caesar or Astra. The constant ether buildup and defense shred from Juyuen Nicole and the increased shock potential from Yanagi Rina were definitely highlights of this testing phase. Now let's move to recommendations. First, if you're using Trigger with a DPS and a support lineup, the best teams by far will include characters like Astra or Caesar and the premium DPS of Miyabi, ZenlessZoneZero Ambi, and Evelyn. However, this isn't to say that other DPS didn't perform well too, as Yanagi as a solo DPS and even Juyuen both still competed fairly well. With this, I would encourage you to give these other lineups a try too, especially if you aren't just using the newest characters released and spamming them. But as always, do some testing yourself, as the performance of said teams will change depending on the fight and your lineup. Moving on from DPS plus support, the next teams I tried involved a DPS and a stunner. To be honest, the performance of these teams also surprised me, as I had originally believed that not having a support to buff the team would result in poor performances. However, as I soon discovered, the second stunners actually provided similar if not better results on occasion. Now, to be clear, this was heavily influenced by the fact that characters like Lighter and Qingyi had better performances than worse support / defense characters like Sokaku, Rina, or Seth, but the overall experience I had testing the double stunner teams was that they were certainly not weak or bad as you may have originally imagined. That said, the best performing double stun teams included compositions like Trigger Evelyn Lighter and Trigger ZenlessZoneZero Ambi and Pulchra. Now, despite there being no surprise in the fact that Evelyn and ZenlessZoneZero Ambi were once again the best DPS to pair with Trigger, there were some other thoughts I had for teams that didn't just include the newest DPS or the most OP stunners from recent patches. Now, unfortunately, although I just said that, most teams that didn't have access to Lighter, Qingyi, or Pulchra in any way, shape, or form were significantly slower in clear time and way worse performers across the board. However, if using some of the newer stunners like Lighter or Qingyi, older DPS like Soldier 11 or Harumasa were actually able to perform more competitively. ability. Now, to be clear, each of these teams did have a lot of optimization available to them to make them perform even better, but regardless of this, I did still find decent success with them when experimenting and testing them over several runs. In truth though, these two team pairings with their ideal limited stunner in the form of Lighter and Qingyi were already performing pretty well even before testing with Trigger. That said, it was very interesting to see a double stun composition perform similar if not only slightly worse compared to stun plus support teams. Recommendation wise though, I would only recommend using double stunner teams if I had the newer limited dazers in my roster. Speaking from experience with initial testing, trying to make something like Trigger, Anton, and Ambi work was definitely not as easy as you might think. Because of this, I would try limiting this strategy to only characters like Lighter, Polker, or Qingyi if you're trying to run double stunners. And regarding DPS options, I do think that you have more choices here, since most DPS could perform very competitively, assuming they had access to said limited stunners. So with this, if you want to use teams like Trigger, Evelyn, Astra, Trigger, Evelyn, Qingyi, or even something like Trigger, Haramasa, Qingyi, feel free to do so, but of course, all of this depends on your roster. Now, before I get into the next type of team, I want you guys to know that I do spend a lot of my day reading and considering a lot of what you guys say when you post in the comment section. I'm human and sometimes I make mistakes. Because of that, I sometimes add new sections, have to make pinned comments after a video is completed, but the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I did miss a couple of teams worth testing in a few of my past videos. More specifically, I didn't spend quite enough time testing the concept of double DPS lineups, and so I did exactly that with this video. From my testing, the best performing double DPS plus Trigger lineup was Trigger Miyabi Yanagi, Trigger Miyabi Bernice, and Trigger Bernice Yanagi. Each of these premium teams were easily some of the fastest, most comfortable, and most consistent clears, rivaling even DPS plus support lineups, but you'd be right if you suspected that these were basically just teams that were carrying Trigger to fast clears. Despite this being the case, I do want to say that having agents like Miyabi, Bernice, or Yanagi while also having a primarily off-field character like Trigger led to some of the most fun that I've ever had in ZenlessZoneZero. Not only was I clearing fights in record time, I got to experience enemies getting blasted from all corners of the arena, even while I was simply just using one agent for the most part. Moving on from these obviously insane teams though, I did also have findings for those of you looking to pair older DPS together as well. Teams like Trigger Bernice Grace, Trigger Piper Bernice, and Trigger Jane Bernice also had decent showings. But speaking transparently again, this was definitely another case of enemy encounter showing biases and Bernice pushing ally agents to be much better than expected. As always, this doesn't mean that a character like Grace or Piper weren't able to clear content or yield satisfactory results, but putting their results up against other double DPS teams showed just how well the other premium teams had performed by comparison. With this, I would really only recommend using double DPS teams if I were including someone like Yanagi or Bernice in the mix. That said, I did also want to give a special mention to Trigger Piper Nekomata, as it was a team that I got asked about quite a bit, but either as a result of skill issue or some other factor, this team did not feel very good to play at all. Now, with all the different teams out of the way, I did have a conclusive top end / best team lineup among all my testing, and in this case it was Trigger Miyabi Astra and Trigger ZenlessZoneZero Ambi alongside Astra. Despite thinking that there was a chance for ZenlessZoneZero Ambi to dramatically outperform Miyabi because she was given a new specially designed set and a whole dedicated stunner as well, this was simply not the case. Even accounting for biases in enemy weaknesses or enemy health count, Miyabi remaining far above other teams and competitive with ZenlessZoneZero Ambi, who is directly buffed by Trigger, makes this impressive even if it wasn't surprising. Now that the teams and kits have been explained though, let's talk about Trigger's pre-farm materials. To get ready for Trigger, you'll need the following materials: 3,705,000 dennies for the purpose of upgrading your agent's skills and ascensions, 30 buster seals, 32 advanced stun seals, and 4 basic stun seals to ascend Trigger to level 60. And as always, in order to level her to level 60, you'll need 300 senior investigator logs. In addition to this, for her skills, you'll need 250 specialized, 75 advanced, and 25 basic electric chips. And to add to this, you'll also need 5 hamster cage passes for all skills to be level 12. To upgrade her core passive to max, you'll also need 9 notorious hunt materials from the Dead End Butcher, and his drops are known specifically as ferocious grips. Regarding her expert challenge boss, you'll need 60 higher dimension data drops from the most recently added boss known as Lumberjack, and if you're looking to pull and upgrade her signature W engine, you'll need 400,000 dennies, 30 specialized, 32 reinforced, and 4 stun components. Finally, in addition to this, to level up said W engine, you'll need 200 W engine energy modules as well. Now regarding Trigger's disk drive sets, she has access to several options, but the newly released Shadow Harmony set was definitely designed with Trigger's kit in mind. Given the extra crit rate and the bonuses to aftershock damage that the set provides, using this as her 4-piece is definitely amazing. That said, you could also use Protopunk, Swing, or Astral Voice for a more team buffer playstyle, or you could equip Shockstar Disco if you decide to focus specifically on dazing alone. Now, in terms of her 2-piece set, using Shockstar as the 2-piece effect is definitely one of the better choices for Trigger, but otherwise using whatever 2-piece set you have access to, or the one that has the most usable substats, will work well too. For W engine choices, Trigger has several options, with Precious Fossilized Core being easily the best A rank option she has. However, unlike with other recent agent releases, old W engines like the Restrained, Blazing Laurel, and Ice Jade Teapot weren't outperformed nearly as hard as with other agents. That said, the difference calculated between the best options in Trigger and her other choices was roughly 12 to 16%. So if you aren't looking to pull for her signature, using Fossilized Core or any recent limited S rank engine will work well too. And now finally, here are the pros and cons for Trigger after extensively testing her. Pros: she is easily one of the most versatile stunners that the game has ever released, pairing nicely with almost any DPS. The damage and buffs that she provides make a significant difference in terms of clear speed and overall performance. Her playstyle is very straightforward, which doesn't require much to learn, and if you want to play a solo main field DPS playstyle, Trigger spends very little time on field. As a final, less meta-oriented pro, I do think that Trigger's sniper stance and overall attacks look very cool, as this is the first time that we've seen this sort of POV. Now, in terms of cons, her additional ability can sometimes restrict your agent lineups, as she is forced to have an attack agent or an electric agent at all times. And as a bit of a double-edged sword, because she isn't on field, you don't get to see her as much, which can be unfortunate if you are someone that wants to see her and appreciate the way that Trigger's kit works. That's going to be it for today's video though, guys. Thank you again for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching though. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.